Welcome to Justice Counts, the podcast that goes beyond the law to what's important to you. Equal justice for all is a guidepost for our nation, but how do we achieve that? Here are your hosts, writer-commentator Bob Gatty and novelist-attorney Mark M. Bello.
Welcome to Justice Counts. I'm Bob Gatty. Today, Mark Bello and I are speaking with David Tabatsky, the author of a riveting book about the Holocaust, The Boy Behind the Door. David has authored, co-authored, and edited many novels, including Friends Like These, The Marijuana Project, The Battle of Zigzag Pass, and Drunk Log. He was our guest on a previous podcast with author Brian Felgoise to discuss their book, Filthy Rich Lawyers, The Education of Ryan Coleman. But The Boy Behind the Door is totally different. It's a story of a young Jewish boy who, with luck, wit, and help from others, manages to escape the Nazis as they murdered friends and family in his hometown in Amsterdam during World War II. David, welcome to our podcast.
Hey, thank you. Thanks so much for having me back. It was really fun the first time. And like you said, this book is way different. Yeah.
Well, very different.
I was just going to mention that, David. We talked to you about Filthy Rich Lawyers, a completely different book than The Boy Behind the Door. This one, it seems to me, from the outside looking in, was far more personal for you. It's based on a true story. The protagonist is an actual Holocaust survivor. Can you tell us the backstory? You actually traveled to Amsterdam, interviewed Salomon Kool. How was it that you were chosen for this project?
Okay, well, there's two backstories. There's the backstory to how it even became possible that I went to Amsterdam and met Sal. That started here in New York City, where I live. There was a man named Sandy Batkin, who was a Jewish businessman who lived in Scarsdale, which is a very upscale, wealthy suburb of New York City. A lot of Jewish people were living there. A lot of Jews who were supporting Israel in the years after the Second World War and the founding of Israel in 1948 and that whole generation after that. And Sandy was one of them. Sandy, if he was alive now, would be in his upper 90s. Somewhere about that. So Sandy was in Aruba, which is a Dutch colony, or at least it was back in the 60s. And they were there on vacation. And Saul was there with his wife, Nettie, also on vacation. And by chance, this Jew from America and this Holocaust survivor were standing in the ocean in their bathing suits, just say, "Who are you? Where do you come from?" Just chit-chat, a normal chit-chat. So, Sandy's saying, "Oh, I'm a Jewish guy. I'm into Israel, and I do real estate, da 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 da." And Saul, in his own very shy, kind of unassuming way, mentioned something about living in Amsterdam during the war and surviving the Holocaust. And he kind of, as he told me when I met him, he kind of thought like, well, okay, maybe that'll be all. We'll move on to talk about other things. He wasn't a person to want to talk about it. And Sandy prodded him. He was astonished. I mean, first of all, it's kind of a shocking coincidence to meet there, literally standing in the ocean on a beautiful sunny day, and to talk and refer to the Holocaust. The two don't go together. And it was the first person, a real peer, they were basically the same age, who had, was a Holocaust survivor. That certainly doesn't happen every day. Sandy had indirectly been exposed to a few older folks who had survived, but never knew them personally. So here he was, just chit-chatting in this very sociable way. And he was pretty well blown away by Saul's story. But I think even more the fact that here's a real human being just a couple feet away from me, just talking to me like a normal person. This is hit him. The reality of it hit him, pretty deeply. Like, this is real people. This is just normal people. This is not the mythology of seeing it on a film. This is just a real guy, just a normal guy with his wife sitting over there on the beach, and he's a Holocaust survivor, and I'm a very safe and wealthy businessman, from a Jewish community in near New York City. I know nothing about surviving anything pretty much, except the traffic jam. So they became friends, and Saul asked him, "Well, don't you want to tell your story?" And I mean, Sandy asked Saul, and Saul was like, "No, not really. It's not just not my nature to do that." And they did another vacation a year, 2 or 3 later, and they developed a friendship. And Saul, over the years, was kept being asked by Sandy, "Do you want to tell your story? I think you should. You should. You should." And finally, Saul, years later said, "Well, I suppose I should for my kids, and I have grandchildren now. Maybe I should quietly, tell the story before I forget too many of the details." Although forgetting was a whole nother thing. That there becomes a reality and a mythology merge in very powerful ways when you talk about the concept of remembering and forgetting. And that's universal to the Holocaust, not specific to Salomon Kool. But Saul had his own version because, he had terrible survivor's guilt. So finally, this is quite a few years ago, Sandy got Saul to commit to doing it. So Saul was like, "Okay, I don't know how to do it." And Sandy said, "I'll find a writer. I'll find somebody." So Sandy just coincidentally met a literary agent during a party out on Long Island in one summer, and she knew me. And so she called me in and she said, "Would you meet with Sandy? I want to try to put you two together. And let's not worry about a publisher yet. Let's just get the book written. I'll take care of finding the publisher when the time comes. That's what I do. I'm an agent." And I was like, "Okay, that's fine." I mean, I just didn't really know what to make of it because I didn't know enough about it. So I met with Sandy. He was very committed to doing it. He had the resources to do it. I told him I was absolutely welcome going to Amsterdam, where I had been already a couple of times just on my own for other things. I had worked there before, performing when I was in my previous career as a variety performer and circus performer. So I had worked in Amsterdam and a couple other places in Holland. So I was happy to go back. And as a child and all through my own upbringing, the son of a cantor in the Jewish tradition, the Jewish religion, I certainly was, I guess maybe let's just say above average, well versed in the Holocaust, in the history, and in meeting many people over the years who were Holocaust survivors. So yeah, it hit some buttons for me in that regard, and that opportunity to kind of mix my background on a personal level and where I was in my career as a writer. So they kind of converged really nicely there. So I went to Amsterdam and I spent a week seeing Saul and his wife Nettie. And Saul took me through the city. He was still physically able to get around okay. We had to, go slowly, but he was able to walk and talk at the same time. And he showed me pretty much everything he could in Amsterdam, where he was, where his family was, where his schools were, the Jewish theater, which had been turned into a deportation center, the children's creche, the little school across the street, all those different things. He showed me, talked about it as much as he could remember, and then, yeah, we filled in the rest over some time.
Well, David, this is a powerful, powerful document about a time in world history that we just must never forget. Is the book targeted at young readers with that purpose in mind?
Yeah, well, primarily because Saul was a week short of his bar mitzvah when the Nazis invaded Holland. So it kind of was a no-brainer in that regard. I knew that I wanted the book to be immediate, and the actual story kind of took care of that. It wasn't even a construction. I wasn't trying to create the context. It was right there. Just tell the story straight out what it was. Don't mess with it. Don't get in the way with any cool artistic blah blah blah. Just stay true to the story, and literally. And so that's where we began with it. And it's made sense to me. If we're talking about a 12, 13-year-old, then wouldn't 12 and 13-year-olds be the primary audience to read it? Or
Yeah, you'd
or
think.
parents or teachers of 12 and 13-year-olds. That was the other thing. I was writing it also for the thousands and thousands of teachers in the English-speaking world who could take this kind of a book and use it as a piece of curriculum, whether it's in a public school, private school, Hebrew school, yeshiva, it doesn't matter. It could be in a Catholic school. Everyone should know this story because it's so representative of so many hundreds of thousands of other people who were in similar situations to Saul for all those years. So yeah, that's why I chose to do it that way, to tell it straight up. And don't forget, there's also, like, you were joking before about yourself, like sometimes preferring to read books that are written for kids because they're easier to take in. There's a lot of older kids, college students even, whose reading levels are still quite young. They're not sophisticated readers, and they don't need quote unquote literary books, especially on a subject so sensitive as the Holocaust.
Right.
I'd like if I could to
So,
dig a little deeper. I don't think I'm ruining anything by asking you this, but I'll issue a spoiler alert to our listeners. Salomon had parents. He had two brothers. He had a sister. All of these people perished in concentration camps, as Salomon later found out. He spent several years on the run, not knowing whether they were alive or dead. Did he share with you what it was like for a boy 13 to 16 years of age? That's the span, essentially, 13 to 18, I guess it was. Did he share with you what
yeah,
that was like? I mean, suddenly a kid with three siblings and two parents is all by himself.
well, it didn't happen overnight. So that was the first thing. It happened in, well, it's weird to say a natural way, but it kind of unfolded. It unfolded over time. Let's say when the Nazis came in to that country in particular, they didn't take everybody right away. It wasn't like they weren't running in the streets shooting people like in certain countries. In some of the countries of the former Soviet Union, they basically did. They came in guns blazing, firing, shooting people and dumping them into big open pits, and that was not unusual. In Holland, it was a little bit different. Maybe it was also because it was earlier in the war. They were still developing their methods of murder, to be blunt. And so there was a lot of indoctrination of the Dutch police forces and the Dutch people who were aligned with them. And so at the same time, there's a scene where Saul's father is quite foreboding. He's listening to the radio. He's hearing news. He's in contact with other people who know that the worst is coming. But then Saul, he's 12 years old, and his older siblings, they're teenagers. They're like, Dad, chill, relax. It's not going to be that bad. It's impossible that nobody's going to invade our country. Are you kidding? And so then it happens slowly but surely. First, you can't ride your bike. Then you can't cross the street. Then you can't go to the theater. Then you have to wear a yellow star. And that took months and months and months to happen. And then one of his siblings disappeared, but they didn't really know where he was. It wasn't like the Germans didn't say, oh, yeah, we took him and we're going to take him here and there and there, and then we're going to kill him on this date. Nothing was like that. Everything was a mystery. And that was part of the power that the Nazis had over that society, was people didn't know what was going on. So, and there was a lot of denial. Plus, you're a teenager. You're kind of you're living in the moment. You don't even really understand it. And then you have parents who are sort of wanting to tell you, but yet they're protecting you. So the father, he's terribly depressed. It's a terribly dark situation for him. But the mother's like telling him, no, don't tell the kids so much. You'll scare them. So there's that friction in the house too, and in probably every Jewish household throughout the city. So even when Saul was finally left alone when his 3 siblings were taken and or disappeared, his father, and then finally his mother and his aunt, which is the kind of climactic scene when the Nazis come in to his house and they go up the stairs and he literally hides behind the door of his bedroom and is saved by 2 soldiers basically who just kind of laugh it off and don't keep looking anymore because they just didn't. I think it was just random luck on that given day in that given moment that they didn't open the.
Well, they were laughing because they shot a mouse, right?
Exactly.
They thought that was funny.
But I'm just saying they weren't even. It was just like another normal day of work for these soldiers.
Yeah.
They were just looking to get off shift, get their boots off, and go drink beer. So they didn't bother to pull that one door open. If they had pulled that door open, there would be no book.
Yeah.
He would have been gone. He would have been taken and gone to the camps as well eventually. So in those days after, he didn't really. It didn't sink into him for quite a while. First of all, it was just survival. I just got to survive. Where do I go? Literally, what's around the next corner? Can I go down this street? Can I go down this alley? Can I knock on the door of a neighbor in another neighborhood that I kind of know? Can I go and see my gymnastics coach and stay in the school for one night and sleep under his desk? I mean, so who in that teenage mind does he have to figure out where his parents are, where his brothers and sisters are? He's just trying to survive. And he's literally living moment to moment, day to day. And that extended out for months.
He couldn't trust his own neighbors, right? I mean, some of the people that he had to deal with were Dutch people who were turning their neighbors in, right?
Well, yeah, he didn't know, but the thing is, he didn't even know yet. He didn't even know yet what we know now. When you're living in that moment, he didn't know the bigger context. Oh my God, there's Jews and there's non-Jews, and which of the non-Jews can I trust and which I can't? What are the trend lines? No, of course, none of that exists. He's just like, can I be safe with this person? Or even his own cousin said to him, you can't stay here. You're not going to be safe.
Yeah.
Because they probably suspect me as a member of the resistance, and so any minute they could come barging in here. You're not going to be safe. Or if they find you a Jew, and I'm not Jewish, because this was basically his cousin-in-law. His cousin, she was Jewish, but her husband wasn't. So he was like, they're going to kill me. So hey, I'd love to help you, but I'm not going to give up my life for you. I mean, that's basically what they're saying, even though he didn't put it in those words. So it was moment to moment for a long time. There wasn't a whole lot of time to digest it. There was no place to find out what was going on. He didn't have access to news or anything like that. Just a lot of rumors. Tremendous.
Did Salomon talk to you about what it was like to suddenly be treated like dirt by people who were once his friends?
To a degree, I think that he also, don't forget his age. He's 15 at this time. Think about what a 15-year-old thinks about, whether it's in the 1940s in Europe or it's a kid on the street right now in Cincinnati, Ohio, who's 15. They're, like, what's going on in my life? What's the next 5 minutes going to be like? And he's scared. He's just basically, he's scared shitless, and he doesn't have family. So he's afraid who he can even ask questions to. So all of that is inside his head. So basically what he did was he shut down certain parts just for his own self-protection.
David, I want to ask you about the title. You kind of rolled by it in one of your previous answers. But I want to make sure our listeners understand. A lot of these stories, and Solomon's is one of them, it's quick thinking, it's fate, it's just plain luck, and they change the course of history from one survivor to the next, or who survives and who doesn't. But the title, The Boy Behind the Door, refers to the clearing out of the house he was living in Can you tell us in more detail what happened?
It's literally the boy behind the door who was hiding. That's where he was practicing his cello. His mother and his aunt were kind of comforted when he would practice. They would take their mind off the whole tragic catastrophe that was happening to their lives. Also, don't forget his mother, she didn't know where her own children were. The other 3 children, she didn't know where her husband was. It wasn't like the Nazis would send emails to somebody and say, okay, we have your husband in this concentration camp. Here's where you can write to him. I mean, I don't mean to make light of it, but I'm just saying that it wasn't. People were living in the dark, literally, and then they were literally living in the dark, keeping windows, shut and keeping lights off, so they would hope that the Nazis wouldn't think anyone was living there. Oh, we've already cleared out that building. In fact, they had done a whole clearing in that building, and then they were still living there, and they hadn't gotten rounded up. But then their time came, like everybody else's, and in Amsterdam, and he was practicing the cello. They heard the trucks and the automobiles coming outside. His mother peeked out, and they looked, and he looked, and she was like, go upstairs, and he didn't want to leave her, and but he I guess in his gut, he didn't really say too much about this. I don't know if he even remembered, because when you experience great trauma, no matter what triggers that trauma, you tend to shut it off in your head. You may shut it off forever in your head. Plus, he was only 15. And I also, in some of these conversations, I did push him for more information. Other times I would back away because I could see it was too painful. Still, as an old man, it was still, I mean, he told me that. He said, I've lived with this, and it's kind of known as survivor's guilt. That wasn't the way he really labeled it, but he knew that term existed. He basically, I lived with survivor's guilt every day of my life. Since this experience, not a day has gone by that I didn't feel the weight of it. He said, I've had a good marriage. I love my wife. She's also a Holocaust survivor. Nettie was really a lovely, lovely woman. And he has 2 kids, and he was close with his kids, his 2 boys who now live in Israel. But he shut down otherwise because the pain was too great. But I think I got a little sidetracked. To wind back to that answer, he literally was shooed upstairs. His mother made him go up. So basically, he said goodbye to his mother there in a split second. Maybe not really digesting. When I go upstairs and hide behind somewhere where I'm going to hide, I'm never going to see my mother again. How do you digest all that and still be scared, be shaking in your boots that soldiers in their heavy boots are coming up the stairs with their guns, and they could just shoot you right on the spot or just murder your mother right in front of you? You don't know. So how does he even stand there quietly behind a door and not let his breathing give him away? I tried to ask him that. He didn't really, I don't know. There was never really a concrete answer about what his consciousness was in that moment. Like I said, it was too traumatizing, and the memory of it is even more. Because like I said, that he said goodbye to his mother and avoided being murdered in the span of 15.
You write in a very powerful way about how this young boy looked at his mother, took a photograph in his mind so he would always remember her. Did he tell you that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Did he tell you
Yeah,
about
to a degree. I mean, he did. It wasn't like he told me and I wrote it down and then that's exactly what went in the book.
Right.
No, I mean, I had to reinterpret things because I was taking notes and I recorded some things, but there was a kind of a gap in between that and when I wrote it. So you have to try to also recreate it on the page that it stands up by itself.
Sure.
As part of a whole story.
Yeah.
So it's hard to explain what that crafting is. It's rather subtle, but you try to create those moments without creating something artificial, if you will,
Right.
just
Right.
because it'll sound good. I could write a great paragraph about that.
Sure.
It'll get you all wound up and suspenseful. But if it doesn't feel right, if it didn't feel authentic to
Mhm.
who I understood Saul to be, then I redid it.
Mhm.
I wouldn't do it. Yeah.
Well, then there was a story about the mouse crawling over his foot,
Yeah.
and he was having a difficult time keeping quiet. And then the mouse went away.
Wouldn't any of us?
Yeah,
I mean,
it's dark. A mouse is crawling over your foot, and then all of a sudden he hears a gunshot, and he has no idea who is being shot or what. And then it turns out
exactly.
it was the mouse
Right.
that was shot, blown away
Yep.
to smithereens.
Just another little joke for the Nazi soldiers. Yeah, let's shoot a mouse. Like completely frivolous,
Yeah,
completely random,
yeah.
and it goes to your point, Mark, about pure luck. Sometimes it was just pure, unadulterated luck. That was the difference between life and death
Mm.
for so many people. Yeah.
We'll be back after this brief message, so stay with us. Another thing that struck me, David, was the number of good people, Gentiles, non-Jewish people, who risked their own lives to save this kid, right?
Yes. Yes. And yeah, absolutely. And he never would have been married, never would have had children. He never would have the
Yeah,
grandchildren who are growing up in Israel to learn about his story and
yeah,
understand this legacy, if you will. Whether we like it or not, there is that legacy. And if you're in the family of a Holocaust survivor, you're forever entwined in it, for better or for worse. And yeah, I mean, it's just so random who helped and who didn't. And he didn't know. It wasn't as if people signed up before the war and said, well, if the Nazis invade, we'll be sympathetic or we won't.
yeah,
That's not how things don't work like that. There isn't any preparatory, system for it. It's just all people responding in the moment. Am I going to do the right thing or am I not?
yeah.
How far will I go to protect my own ass and not help anybody else? Or will I take some level of risk? And what level of risk am I okay with? What can I live with?
Right.
Because it wasn't just sometimes it was people taking risks, but they're risking their entire
But
family,
these
like
stories,
the Rose family
Mm.
up in outside of Holland. He was Mr. Rose would tell him like I'm happy to do this, or not happy maybe, but I feel like this is the right thing to do. But I'm risking the lives of everyone here.
these stories are just incredible
Right.
humanity stories, though. It amazes me
Phew.
as much
Yeah.
as Holocaust stories portray the evil men do. They also portray the opposite side of those stories and the good that righteous people do.
Thank God.
I want to ask
Yeah.
you because my wife would be upset at me if I don't ask you this because she loves a love story. And the book doesn't delve too much into the relationship, but Solomon actually falls in love with the daughter of one of the couples that are hiding him.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, you don't go too far into the relationship. In one scene they're in bed together. I think we can use our own imagination, but he ends up marrying Nettie, who's a different woman than I'm talking about.
Yeah.
The woman is Marta Rose,
Hmm.
and I'm wondering if there's a scene where they say goodbye to each other forever, and they seem to know that it's goodbye forever. And I'm sitting there, I'm crying during the whole scene.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if he ever heard or saw her again.
No, he didn't. And remember, there's one scene I can't remember exactly where it is off the top of my head right now, but where he's told. I think it's Mr. Rose. I think it's her father, this young woman's father, who he's had this relationship with. He tells Saul, "Don't look back. Go
Right.
find your life again or find it anew, and don't look back. Don't forget, he's talking to an 18-year-old young boy who's been through years of trauma. And his advice, I think, is good. It's the best he can give in the moment. In fact, what other positive, advice can you give someone at that age? Don't look back. And so, but to answer your question a little bit more, and your wife, I think Saul was embarrassed when he told me about this experience. I sensed an embarrassment to him, almost as if I talk about this too much, I'm almost being unfaithful to my wife. It's almost wrong because he was such a modest, lovely man. Like, it's almost as if, when you get married, you go, well, of course you're the first woman I've ever been with. Kind of thing, right? But we almost want to believe that because it's sort of this pure, virginal, spiritual bond of two people that were meant for each other and no one else ever existed in the world. And I think that, to a certain degree, a lot of people want to believe that or buy into some level feeling of it. Even if it's not literally true, we want it to feel that way. And so, like, when we say in our wedding vows, forever, what's it called?
Forsaking all others.
Yeah, forsaking all others, even the ones that we might have been with before, they don't really count. Or they didn't really happen. She was a figment of my imagination, and I'm sorry about even having an imagination that didn't include you in it. So I think, so apart from the context of the Holocaust and everything else, I think just Saul as a man just felt that. Plus, when you add on what his wife literally went through as a survivor himself, I think he just wanted to honor some perfect love, some purity, something that couldn't be tarnished by what happened during those years. And even though he had this lovely connection with this young woman, it was in the context of the Holocaust. It was in the context of this hell. It was in the context of abject, total murder and suffering and threat, constant threat. So I think he needed to leave that behind too. And I don't think he wasn't really curious about it anymore. It was totally overweighed by, is my family even alive? How can I think about a young, beautiful girl, and I don't even know if my mother, my sister, my brothers, my father are even alive? I don't think I don't think there's room in the head to even have those two things coexist. And so
it's an interesting take on this, on that. That didn't occur to me, but that's an interesting take. Don't look back. I understand.
Yeah, because that advice was kind of
David,
shocking, but then it made sense. It made perfect sense.
We know that some people survived and escaped from the camps. We know that 6 million Jews died. But do we know how many told similar stories like Solomon's? We know about Anne Frank, of course.
Yeah, I was in Amsterdam recently, and I was going through the Anne Frank house. I've probably been there 3 or 4 times before over the years, and I was there when I visited Saul. He didn't want to go in, and he had been, but we didn't go together. But I did go on one of those days when I was there. This last time when I was there, at the end of September this year, I couldn't help thinking the whole time I was thinking of Saul, as if he had been living there too. It was such a visceral thing. I had real trouble going through the tour of the house. I mean, I knew what was in there. Nothing of it was surprising to me, but this, it's hard to explain. Just this visceral connection to this man who was basically the same age as my father. No, a little younger. My father was actually a soldier in the Second World War, but so yeah, he was a little older, but old enough to be my father, let's say. And it was. I think when you're in the Anne Frank house, that's when you realize how many other places were people hiding. They didn't have the famous book and all the bells and whistles that come with it. And that's the thing I think is remarkable about this story of Salomon Kool, is that it's not remarkable. It's not unusual.
Which is remarkable.
Yes, exactly. That's my point. It's remarkable because it's so ordinary. There were thousands of people who were hidden, who were helped by resistance fighters and by Christians and all kinds of people. And
To Bob's question though, was that a Dutch thing, or was this happening in
no, I don't
in
think
France,
it was.
in Poland?
Yes, absolutely. It was not intrinsically Dutch. Although the Dutch, especially in cities like Amsterdam and Rotterdam, which are big port cities, for hundreds and hundreds of years, they've traditionally been more open to visitors, immigrants, call them whatever you will, people who are passing through, people who are, emigrating to the country. That's why, for example, in a lot of in the cities in Holland, people speak multiple languages. It's just woven into the fabric of that European port cities. But in the countryside, not any different really than the American countryside. The exposure to other people is minimal. For some of the people that Saul interacted with in the country, they hadn't really met a Jew before.
Were there righteous Gentiles helping people all over Eastern Europe?
Yeah, even in Germany. I mean, if you look, you could probably Google non-Jews helping Jews in Berlin during the Holocaust.
Okay.
And you'll find many anecdotal, not full-length books, but you'll find, tidbits of at least or longer pieces of those stories that happened in France, all over Europe, all over. Yeah. So your point
very
before
brave people
about it within this horror, within this unimaginable horror of this Holocaust, among all the people who were murdered, there were also many people who were saved. And so when I want young people to read this book, to understand the abject horror of it, to understand the evil that human beings are capable of, and who can actually organize and do it with strategy, not just do it out of anger or hatred, they cold-blooded strategy and execution. There are also people on the good side of humanity. And I think we need to find that balance. We need to feed it, and we need to directly teach. And we need it now more than ever. I mean, just look at the place we're living in.
Oh, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. David, one of the you did a great job of portraying Solomon's father. Reading between the lines, it seems like the guy was losing his mind, especially when it came to, I put myself, as I read that, I tried to put myself in his position. What would you do as a father responsible for this family of your wife, your and your kids? What would you do? How would you handle this? What would you do?
Yes, I had the same exact feeling as a father myself.
And his response was, well, we all need to commit suicide. And that was just, when I saw that, I thought, wow. And the young boy, Salomon, was it he who said, Dad, do you want us to kill ourselves? Is that who said that?
Yeah, one of the kids, yeah. But that, there's a history. If you go back to in Jewish history, there are other episodes where there were suicides. I mean, if you go look at Masada, and other examples where Jews who knew we're going to be annihilated. It's just a fact. There's no getting around it. We're going to be destroyed. We are not going to give them the power and the pleasure that they will get from literally doing it. We will be in control at the end of our own lives. You can't take full control. And so there was tradition in that. There was also that kind of, I don't know, certain existentialism, whether you want to, whatever you want to ascribe to it psychologically. But, sad to say, he turned out to be right.
He turned out to be right.
Yeah. He didn't even know
couple of
how
the
right
boys
it was.
said no. A couple of the boys said no. We're going to fight. They
Hmm.
were asked how. They didn't know. Everybody but Salomon were killed,
Except Solomon wasn't. So
except Solomon. I said, but Solomon.
Solomon was right, and Dad wasn't. Dad was wrong.
He was too young. I think he was too young to even. He was too young still at that time to really even digest it. Look at the scene early on when they're laughing and playing around in the street on their way to the synagogue. They're pushing each other into traffic and messing around, and they're just being siblings. And they're all picking on him because he's the youngest one. He's the little star of the moment because it's his bar mitzvah. And the father is kind of, oh, tamp it down. We can't be celebrating. Look what's about to happen. And they're like, what? I don't see anybody. Basically, they're like, there's no army coming down the street. What are you worried about? Go listen to the radio. But don't. It's not going to really happen. Again, it's just normal human psychology that you keep denying something awful. Like, look what our whole world is doing with climate change. Oh no, there's no climate change, and then suddenly, like, the islands disappeared, and the cities are getting flooded out, and they're still in denial. It's like,
I want to ask you about the aftermath of the war. Solomon doesn't go to Israel. He doesn't come to America. He goes back to Amsterdam. And I'm wondering what life was like for Jews in Amsterdam after the war. Can you give our readers a sense of post-war Amsterdam? How many Jews survived and returned? Did they rebuild the population? Were they permitted to return to their own homes? How were they treated by the Christian population that once depressed them? I mean, how did all the populations get along?
well, first of all, just to be clear, I do not have data on how many exactly came back, how many survived. That's certainly available. I didn't prioritize that in the book. That should be, if there's a study guide written to it, that would certainly be in the study guide. And that there's hopefully that will happen down the road. That's a good question though. In general, there was something that I did intimate a little bit about. It was difficult for him. The Dutch government afterward, they were in survival mode, literally like in economic survival mode. How do we get crops growing again? How do we get, how do we keep people warm in the winter? How do we even like for example, Germany was physically devastated. The United States had to come in and basically, okay, we destroyed your country. Now we're going to rebuild it. And so there was a certain amount of that in the Netherlands as well. Some of the infrastructure, had been completely bullied by the Nazis, and some of it had been destroyed. Some of there was obviously there was some bombing. Excuse me. And so there was a lot of destruction. There was a tremendous amount of uncertainty. Who's really in charge here? Who do we get? How do we trade with our partners? Who do we trust? There was a lot of that in the aftermath of the war. The Americans were, had their own prioritizing about which countries they were going to help and get who gets in line in what order, because everything can't happen instantly. Saul was obsessed though the whole time in the aftermath of the war, from the time he got on the bus to Amsterdam towards right the very end of the book, and he comes back into the city. No one has any answers for him. He can't find. It took him quite a while to find out where his family was and when they perished, in what camps. It was total chaos in the months and even longer after the war just to get information. And also because the Dutch government was so obsessed with rebuilding, they were not, I would say, my impression is that there was a real mixed bag of empathy and not disdain, but ignorance, where a lot of people, the Christians in that government who managed to survive, obviously, some of them were relatively unfazed by it. They managed to stay in a bubble during the war. They avoided it. There wasn't any like hand-to-hand combat in Amsterdam, for example. And so after the war, they were less than empathetic to what some of the survivor stories were, like Saul. They didn't have much room. They were like, man, we got to rebuild this. We got to rebuild this road. We need money for this. We got to make sure there's heating for that. Winter's coming and blah, 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 blah. And you want to know where your parents are? We don't have time for that. Go find them yourself. I mean, I'm not.
How did all of this affect Saul's spirits, his outlook? Was he sullen, bitter, haunted?
Haunted. I wouldn't say at all
Yeah.
he was sullen or bitter. That was one thing I thought was really remarkable about him. And many, many Holocaust survivors I have met in my life, this lack of bitterness is remarkable. It's astonishing if you think about how many reasons there are to be bitter, how many reasons there are to be maybe hopeless about humanity, right? But yet, most Holocaust survivors are just incredibly positive. But there's something also that at the same time has been wounded so deeply that we can't understand it. And I think Saul is indicative of that. He also, I think, was just a relatively unassuming guy, just in general. Aside from that experience, I think he was just a more quiet, unassuming, modest human being. Yeah. Maybe that also was him as the youngest child. That he grew up to the time he was, 13, 14, being a little overshadowed by his older siblings. It was weird, I think, for him to basically grow up and become an adult in the context of the Holocaust is so unique. There isn't anything you can compare it to at all as to how he became a young man during that time. And then
I got the impression that a man by the name of Walter Susskind, if I'm pronouncing it correctly,
it is, Susskind,
was responsible for saving a lot of Jewish lives, including to some degree Salomon. Can you tell our listeners who he was?
Yeah, I want to hold this up. Can you see this?
I was just going to ask you about that.
Can you see it?
Ask you about the book based on his life.
Yeah, can you see this okay?
Secret Carnage, it says.
Right.
Secret Courage?
Secret Courage, the Walter Susskind story. This is a DVD. This is a documentary film that was made, I think it came out in the early 2005. It came out. And this tells the story of Walter Susskind, this German Jew who ended up in Amsterdam, who saved hundreds of Jewish kids. The Nazis were using the German theater, the Jewish theater of Amsterdam. Traditionally, that building was the Jewish theater of Amsterdam. There was a big Jewish community there, obviously, and the perverse choice to use that building. How deeply cynical and violent that was, to take what was the Jewish theater and turn it into the detention center, which was the embarkation point where all the Jews were rounded up. They were sent there, and then they were sent out on the trains to different camps. Saul's siblings and his mother and father were there. Saul was in that building until Walter Susskind came across him, realized what age he was, but said, "Hey, you're small." That's also what saved Saul, literally, was his size. His physical size is what saved him. If he had been more average size to what a young man is when they're 15, 16, he wouldn't have lived. He would have been treated as an adult. But because he was little, he was really prepubescent in that way. He was able, Walter Susskind arranged for him to go across the street into the children's creche, which is basically the kindergarten, if you will, not a school so much, but a place for children, a nursery. He was a kid, like an older kid, but he was still could pass, to be a child. and that saved him. And those stories between him and the nurses, I thought those were incredible. Talk about people putting their lives on the line. I mean, they were stashing babies inside blankets and garbage cans and all. They're getting babies out to families who would take them and hide them away. And there's many stories of children who survived the Holocaust as babies in Christian families. Some of them grew up never even knew until much later, when they realized, like, wait a minute, I'm an orphan. Where are my real parents? What happened to them? And then they find out that they're Holocaust survivors. Others knew about it, of course. So in this DVD, there's a quote from Saul on the back that sums it all up in my mind. He says, "You will come over it, but you never forget it. You live with it, and you go dying with it, and you never forget." That sums up Saul's entire adult life.
Where can people get a hold of you and grab a copy of your book?
Well, they could go first on the website, theboybehindthedoor.org, O-R-G, all one word, theboybehindthedoor.org. You can go online. Usually the easiest platform people go on, whether they like it or not, is Amazon. You can also go on to Barnes & Noble and other book-selling sites online. If you go into your local bookstore, they can order it for you. People can find out more about me at my website, which is www.tabatsky.com, Tabatsky, Tabatsky.com. Then, I mean, you could find out other things about what I've done in my life and some of the.
Well, thanks so much, David, for being with us today for both of our podcasts, Lead to the Left and Justice Counts. We really do appreciate you being here, and it's an incredible story. Thank you. Now, one more short break, and I'll be right back with some closing remarks. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Meanwhile, if you haven't done so already, please check out Mark Bello's Ripped from the Headlines legal thrillers, all available online at Amazon and other major online booksellers. He has quite the hero in attorney Zachary Blake, who fights for justice on all fronts. His books are Betrayal of Faith, Betrayal of Justice, Betrayal in Blue, Betrayal in Black, Betrayal High, Supreme Betrayal, Betrayal at the Border, and his latest, You Have the Right to Remain Silent. For more information, just check markmbello.com. Until next time, this is Bob Gaddy for Mark Bello, signing off from Justice Counts.